Hello and welcome back to Like Maria. Today we're going to look at Macbeth, and in particular we're going to look at the sources that Shakespeare used to write the story of Macbeth. So after today you'll understand more about Macbeth, just like Maria. I was in class the other day, and actually I was teaching Hamlet, not Macbeth, and I brought in some source material from Saxo Grammaticus, in this case for Hamlet. And this was with a group of A-level students who had done quite a lot of work on Hamlet. And I was really gobsmacked when some of them said to me, "So Shakespeare didn't write the story of Hamlet?" And I said, well, no, it's in a source that he would have known about, and he's taken the story and developed it. And they were absolutely astounded. And then they began to question me about other Shakespeare plays, and lots of them had done Macbeth for GCSE. And they said, well, what about Macbeth? And I said, well, no, he definitely didn't write the story of Macbeth, because Macbeth is in fact one of the ones that we've got a really good source for, and we know that Shakespeare used it. So that's why I'm doing this video today, to tell all you students who are doing GCSE Macbeth that Shakespeare didn't write the story. So what we do have instead of Shakespeare is a 16th century source for this story. Now, of course, let's be clear. Shakespeare wrote the play and wrote all the words in the play, although actually that's not right either. Some of the words are, we don't know that Shakespeare actually wrote himself, and they're the particular words of the scene where Macbeth revisits the witches. You might have come across that scene with Hecate and the witches. So backtrack a little bit, we'll go back to the source. So 1577, a chap called Hollands Head writes a history of Scotland. And in that history of Scotland, he writes the story of Macbeth, and he writes the story of King Duncan's murder. So what we end up with is in 1577, this chap Hollands Head writing a history of Scotland, and then a few years later, Shakespeare thinks, oh, that event in Scottish history, that'd make a great play. I'll use some of that material. Now, let's be clear about Hollands Head. He's not necessarily a straightforward historian. Some of what he writes is embellished for certain reasons, and some of it has a slightly almost mythological, kind of Robin Hood-esque value to it. So it's not 100% Scottish history, but it's some of the stories about Scotland in an earlier period that he's writing about. So there we have Hollands Head, 1577. Now I hear you thinking, why does all this matter to me studying my GCSE? The key thing, and the key reason why it matters, is because we have Hollands Head versus Shakespeare, and we want to look at what Shakespeare did with the original story. The way Shakespeare uses that story informs us about what he wanted to do with his play, and in particular how he wanted to entertain the audience and paint certain characters. So you can see on the slide, I've done a handy little table for you. Holinshed Head's Chronicles, and then Shakespeare's play. And I've outlined here some of the differences. So first of all, we start off with Duncan. In the Hollands Head, he is a young and feeble ruler. He was soft and gentle of nature. And we note that Macbeth rules in a kind of okay way for 10 years. So that's all in the source material. Now, let's think about Shakespeare's play. In Shakespeare, Duncan is not feeble or young or soft or gentle. He is a well-respected king who is triumphant in battle. When Macbeth kills Duncan, he then becomes king very quickly, and he becomes a tyrant very quickly, a bad king who embarks on a mission of slaughtering anyone he considers to be a threat to him. So what we see here is Shakespeare has taken the original source, and he has made Macbeth look worse and Duncan look better. And in making Duncan look better, he makes Macbeth look worse, because if you kill a good king, that's kind of worse than killing a king who wasn't much use. So what I'm saying here is that King Duncan is characterised by Shakespeare to make Macbeth's sin and the tragedy seem a whole lot worse. He's also just taken Macbeth quickly from a place of good to a place of evil to create drama really quickly. Okay, second difference I want to talk about today is Banquo. Now, Banquo in the original source in Hollands Head helps Macbeth kill Duncan. In the Shakespeare, we know that it's only Lady Macbeth who knows about Duncan's murder. Now, interesting here, Banquo in the Hollands Head history and in Scottish history in general is descended from James I. So Shakespeare has a vested interest here in making Banquo look like a good guy. It wouldn't be ideal for Shakespeare to be writing Banquo as a bad character if he is descended from James I, because Shakespeare wants to be in with the king. He doesn't want to upset the king. So here we have Shakespeare changing the story to focus solely on Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. I also think this increases the drama and it enables lots of moments between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth to be really focused on when they have the argument about Macbeth not going back and not bringing the daggers and all of that. I think it's really a real high dramatic moment, and to have another person in on the act would perhaps water those dramatic moments down. And let's face it, Shakespeare is in the business of big drama. While we're on that note, still with Banquo, Shakespeare writes in Banquo's ghost. So in the histories, Hollands Head histories, no ghost. No Banquo at the feast. No Banquo at the banquet. In Shakespeare, we get Banquo appearing as a ghost, and that really traumatic scene for Macbeth and Lady Macbeth where Macbeth begins talking to the ghost. Now this is brilliant for drama and performance. It's one of the key scenes in Macbeth where you can really see Macbeth's paranoia and his guilt coming out. And Shakespeare has written that in and used the literary device, the dramatic device of bringing that ghost in to stir up a bit of excitement. Obviously, a 17th century audience would find this really very fascinating and perhaps even a bit scary, thinking about how the ghost might have been presented on stage and the presence of a character that may be supernatural. So real good impact. All great revenge tragedies in the run-up to this, going back into history, all great revenge tragedies had a ghost. We've got the ghost from Hamlet. Macbeth was another good place to have one. Last point I want to make today is about Lady Macbeth. And again, Lady Macbeth in the Hollands Head sources has a rather limited role. However, Shakespeare decides to move her to the fore, and she really has got quite a key role. She has some soliloquies, and she is a key influence behind Macbeth. We also get the rather traumatic scenes at the end where she is sleepwalking, and then we hear of her suicide. So Shakespeare has taken a character who's quite limited in the original source and really improved her status in the play, and I think therefore cultivated this kind of evil witch-like character, and perhaps in quite a misogynistic way shown how the female can often influence the male, rather like an Adam and Eve scenario. So really important to note that. Developing this idea about Lady Macbeth, I just want to leave you today with some quotes from the original source journal. And I think these are ones that Shakespeare would have looked at and thought carefully about in developing this role of Lady Macbeth. Interestingly, Holinshed in 1577 writes that men and women were equal in labour and painfulness. He says that men and women had similar roles. This is in the Scottish society that he's writing about. And I think that's really key when you're considering Lady Macbeth's influence on Macbeth in this play. He also said that women went to war, and this is a really pertinent quote here. and slew the first living creature that they found, in whose blood they not only bathed their swords, but also tasted thereof with their mouths. Now, if we look at Lady Macbeth and look at the sort of imagery that she uses when she's talking about the blood, and she's talking about that speech where she talks about unsex me because she wants to be more like a man, and she's quite prepared for violence. She talks about how she would have killed Duncan if it hadn't reminded her of her father, but there is quite a violent thread here, and I think here some of these ideas that Holinshed is writing about women in the earlier period in Scotland feed through to the portrayal of this particular Scottish woman that we have in Macbeth. So I hope that today you've discovered a little bit more about Shakespeare's sources, and that you are now ready to write about context in Macbeth, just like Maria. Remember to like our video if you've enjoyed it and found it helpful.